the witches after tea party. Requirements to be a witch. One. Colette dipped her hands into the freezing cold water, her narrow shoulders shuddering. Colette, gah, it's cold. So cold. She rubbed her numbing fingers together in the water while letting out frosted breaths. The dirt clinging to her fingers slowly washed away into the river, and she began to feel them again. It was that time of the year where it was getting much colder. Colette's hometown didn't really get that warm to begin with. However, even if she was used to that, it didn't mean that she was immune to the chill of the ice season. To make matters worse, the air was far, far colder this year compared to the typical year. Though adults would probably laugh it off as her being cheeky if she used a phrase like, compared to the typical year, considering she was still 12 years old. Colette, they're all cleaned up now. Still, it's so cold. I'm gonna have to hurry and warm myself up by the fire. Colette drew her washed hands out from the water, then picked up her bracelet, which she'd left on a nearby tree stump, and slipped it back onto her wrist. With a shudder of her narrow shoulders, she turned back towards her small cabin. She'd already gone ahead and kindled a fire in front of her cabin, having imagined something like this would have happened. Back when she'd still not been used to these kinds of chores, she'd ended up putting off lighting the fire until later. But because of that, she'd kept failing to light it due to her frozen numb fingers, and had been left unable to even get warm. Nevertheless, Colette took those failures as a learning experience, one that would help her to spread her wings out and grow. She would probably fail again when she next unfurled them, but she'd use those failures as a learning experience as well. Slowly but steadily, one step at a time. That was Colette's mantra. Colette, I don't need to rush since it's the ice season, though it'll be much tougher on me if I don't. So Colette began to walk over to her cabin so she could warm herself by her fire, all the while checking off the steps she'd done from her fingers. Then, stranger, you there, do you perhaps have a moment? Suddenly, Colette heard a voice echoing. She stopped in her tracks, having been in the motion of heading back. She'd heard a girl's voice, one which she wasn't familiar with. The village she'd been raised in wasn't that big, so all its inhabitants knew each other. She could immediately tell who it was when anyone spoke. Since her voice hadn't matched any of them, Colette felt a little, or rather, fairly surprised. She nervously turned around to look at the river where she'd just washed her hands in. However, surprise came to her in that moment in a manner that was far greater than her surprise at the unfamiliar voice. Colette. Wah, stranger. My apologies, but it looks like I could use some help. The cold waters dropped my body temperature right down, and I feel like I'm about to lose consciousness. I may die, you see. The individual was being swept away by the freezing cold river as she said that to Colette. Colette barely managed to stop herself from letting out a scream before hurriedly reaching her hand out to the girl in the river. Stranger, you have my thanks. I would have ended up drowning if you'd left me there. Or perhaps I would have frozen to death first. Either way, I would have died. Some people believe that freezing to death is an easy way to die, like falling asleep. But having actually felt what hypothermia is like when I was soaked in the river, I would say that it doesn't seem one bit easy, wouldn't you agree? Colette. Colette felt overwhelmed by her companion, who was rattling on, showing no signs of stopping as they warmed themselves by the fire. But it wasn't like she wasn't showing a response to what had just occurred. Her companion's face was awfully pale, and her fingers were trembling with cold. Perhaps she was delirious, cornered down in both mind and body, Colette thought. She felt sorry for the shivering girl who was still showing a smile. She gently offered her some freshly boiled water in an attempt to ease her suffering. Stranger, something hot to drink. Truly, you have my thanks. Restoring one's body temperature back to normal is the most important thing to do when dealing with hypothermia. It makes sense in that respect to warm one's body up from the inside. So you had that kind of knowledge inside you all along, even though you look like you come from an environment with lackluster education. Colette, I'm not really sure about education, but like even children, never mind adults, know to give someone who's cold a hot drink, no? Stranger. Right, I was the one being big-headed here. Then I shall gratefully accept your drink. The girl brought her parted lips to her cup of hot water, then almost dropped it, likely because it was so hot to the touch. She breathed on it and somehow started to drink from it. Colette, what a strange girl. Colette muttered that to herself, without even meaning to. The girl had been carried in by the cold river. That expression alone carried a strange vibe to it. However, the girl gave off an odd impression in many other respects. She had long pink hair and was wearing a cloak made for men, as well as shoes that didn't at all seem suitable for a girl as slender and petite as her. She looked to be close to Colette in age and was probably a tad shorter than her. However, her facial features were quite attractive, so much so that Colette couldn't take her eyes off them. She possessed a beauty that was unsuiting to her age, and the most eye-catching feature about this girl's appearance was stranger. Have my ears perhaps caught your attention? Colette realized for the first time that she'd been staring at the girl's ears, at her distinctive, long ears. Many different kinds of demi-human lived in this world, but amongst them, there was only one species that was renowned far and wide for their long, beautiful ears. Colette, are you an elf, stranger? The answer to that question is a difficult one. Certainly, the girl who I got this body from had elvish blood flowing through her, but it's hard to say whether the same blood is flowing through her body when it was reproduced like this. If we were to dig more into it, then it's also a matter of which out of one's body or soul revolves as its main driving force. This body is elf, but my soul clearly isn't, Colette. Stranger. I'm dipping into my bad habits again, aren't I? The girl finally answered her question, though Colette hardly understood what she'd said. Still looking around, the girl brushed her chest with her finger and then drew a breath. Some kind of blue, glittering stone, which looked rather beautiful, was hanging there over the girl's chest. She held it pinched between her fingers as she mumbled, I get it, to herself. Stranger. There's some really noisy girls around, you see. I'll go ahead and recognize myself as an elf here, so as to keep things going smoothly. Colette. Then could it be that you're much older than me? Stranger. How old am I? If you mean this body, then I suppose I could say that I'm roughly 400 years old. Colette. 400 years old. Colette had heard that elves were a species which lived for far longer in contrast to their looks. But even so, 400 years was quite a surprise, far beyond what she could fathom. Because when it came to the topic of 400 years, Colette, back then, was when the Witch of Envy was carrying out her evil. Stranger. The girl's expression clouded over immediately after she'd let the name of that abominable witch slip through her mouth. Her expression could only literally be described as having clouded over. Colette felt deeply regretful, wondering if her careless remark had hurt her. Stranger. Oh, you didn't do anything wrong. It's just that I had a few things on my mind. Which reminds me, I still haven't heard the name of my benefactor yet. Colette, I'm Colette and I live in this cabin. Stranger. I see, I shall remember it, Colette. My name is Omega, for now that'll do. Colette, Omega-chan, Omega. I'm really not too used to people calling me by Chan. It sounds rather sweet, wouldn't you say? Not blaming Colette for her blunder, the girl, Omega, gave her an adorable, yet relatively intelligent smile. And while keeping that smile on her face, she spoke, Omega. While we're on the topic of sweet, do you have anything to eat? It seems like my once slumbering stomach has kicked back into life after drinking your hot water. I'm famished. Though feeling unsure as to whether she was good or bad at relying on the kindness of others, Colette willingly complied with Omega's request. Luckily, Colette had a rabbit in her cabin that she'd caught just before she'd found Omega, so she began to quickly prepare it and cook it for the starving girl. Omega. Colette, for such a young girl, you sure know your way around knives, don't you? There's no hesitation in your hands as you handle the rabbit. Colette. My parents passed away, so I had to help out with adult work since I was small. That's why I'm pretty good at catching wild rabbits like this one. Oh, Omega, are you okay with eating meat? Omega. Yeah, I have no problem with it. Even so, rabbits, Colette. What about them? Omega. Nothing, it's just that I've had a recent run of fate with them, so they're like bad luck to me. Naturally, I have no problem with eating them, so I'm looking forward to it. Since she was expecting from her, Colette determined herself to cook it properly for her rare, yet welcome visitor. She really wanted to take the time to roast it with some herbs. But from the way Omega was lying on the floor, bursting with hunger, it didn't seem like she could afford to wait any longer. All she could do was sprinkle some salt and pepper on it as she hurriedly roasted it on the fire, preparing it with speed in mind. The fragrance lured Omega back to her feet, which she did so unsteadily. "Colette, here you go. It's hot, so be careful when you eat it." "Omega, oh dear, you mean that because you saw me mess up with the hot water earlier, right?" "Sure, I've been showing you a bunch of clumsiness for a while now, but that's because this body appears to be more sensitive to hot stuff than my original one." In all honesty, Colette had no clue what she was talking about anymore. Nevertheless, Omega accepted the rabbit meat she'd offered, served on the bone. She breathed hard on it, before then daintily taking a bite out of it. Daintily taking a bite out of it. It felt like a weird expression to use, but at least that seemed to be the only way Colette's eyes could describe it. Even Palmyra, who lived in the biggest house of the village, wouldn't have been able to eat this in such a captivating fashion, she thought. "Omega, me being washed away by the river earlier was also like that, but you see, I've been asleep for quite a long time. It's been a very long time since I stood and walked on my own 2 feet." "Colette, really? Is that why you ended up forgetting how to swim?" "Omega, no, I've never been able to swim. I was swept away by the river because I was trying to get some water to quench my thirst, and I slipped. My legs were shorter than I remembered them being after all." She took another bite out of her meat on the bone, as she proudly professed that she couldn't swim with a shake of her leg. Colette's conversation with Omega was refreshing, considering she was used to passing time in idle boredom. From what she'd heard, Omega appeared to be in the middle of an aimless journey. Frankly, given her age and her ability to handle things, didn't her traveling alone seem like a recipe for disaster? Colette, though hesitant, offered her a proposal. "Colette, if it's okay with you, why don't you stay in my cabin for a little while? It's going to get way colder, so I think you should prepare properly for your journey." Omega, I appreciate the offer, but even if I allow you to do all that for me, there's not much I can give back in return, Colette. Then please tell me a story, Omega. A story? Colette got a positive response to her proposal, thus taking away the reason for Omega's own hesitation from her. She was an elf with a long lifespan who'd lived for more than 400 years. A being that was familiar with events that many living in the present had no knowledge about. "Colette, it'd make me really happy if you told me some stories that I don't know, like, for example, a story from long ago, from the times that no one knows about." Omega. Omega closed one of her eyes and nodded as soon as Colette had asked her that. Then Omega. "Indeed, people typically want to know, don't they?" He was strange in that respect as well. Colette. Omega. "My apologies. I was talking to myself. I don't mind. Talking with people has always been one of my favorite things to do after all. If you're okay with that, then I suppose I shall trouble you for a little while." Omega gave her a small smile, which indicated that she'd accepted Colette's proposal. 3 Omega. The world was a tough place for humans to live in 400 years ago. Magic was an exclusive strong suit demi-humans and spirits had, regardless of which country you were in. Humans even struggled at building fires. Omega snapped her fingers as she spoke, making the flames of the fire dance. A few days had passed with Omega staying in Colette's small cabin. In that short amount of time, this young-looking elf had rewritten everything she knew about the world, one by one. At first, when she'd been swept in by the river, Omega had seemed to her like a bundle of danger. However, the way she displayed her knowledge and magic in these various everyday scenes had changed Colette's perception of her. Omega was heedless, and an absent-minded kind of gal to boot. Nevertheless, the reason she was able to keep traveling with a disposition like that was because she possessed the power to make it more or less feasible. She could easily tell how powerful Omega was by just looking at the way she created fire, boiled water, chopped firewood with the wind, and tilled the soil with a mere snap of her fingers. Omega. A knack for magic, indeed. I would like to say that it's become possible for anyone to do this sort of stuff with some practice, but that would be wrong. Magic, too, is an art, so it greatly depends on the qualities of the individual. As far as I know, there are only 2 or 3 people in history who can do what I can. In history, not in the world. Her use of that expression conjured up images of Omega's grandiosity in Colette's mind. She was taken aback, gripped by Omega's face in profile as she declared that without showing any signs of laughing it off as being bombastic, let alone as being braggadocious. Omega unreservedly declared that she was one of the best in the world, and not out of conceit. A certain word popped up in Colette's mind seeing her like that. How would Omega react if she were to muster her courage and say it out loud? Omega, if you've got something to say, why don't you try and say it? Omega said that in a quiet tone as she looked at the taciturn Colette. While feeling like those clear blue eyes had seized her, Colette spoke that word out loud. As soon as she heard what it was, Omega gave her most bewitching smile yet. Omega, yes, it's like that, of course. I'm quite the wicked witch, you know. That was her reply. In other words, Colette's life had become such that she was spending her daily life with a witch who knew about the days of yore. For Omega. Why am I wearing a cloak that doesn't fit me, you ask? That's because it didn't belong to me from the start. I received it from someone else. Omega calmly answered Colette's question as the latter hung up her cloak to dry, having just been washed. Colette had a fondness for asking questions, and often pestered Omega for stories, which had been the condition she'd offered her for staying here. Her overwhelming curiosity was something which Omega liked, considering she loved to talk. Omega, after all, most people tend to either ignore me when I'm talking pleasantly, or they'll forcibly tell me to shut up from the start. Colette, really? But that's such a waste. Your stories are super interesting, Omega, and I love finding out about all these things that I didn't know about. Omega, MHHM, that's good. Knowledge is a treasure that no one can steal from you. Whereas, with stuff like possessions, it's basically like, having more of them can only give you more of an edge in life. There were many situations where not having knowledge would lead one to being compelled to take the long way around things. Even the act of lighting a fire had been a struggle for humans, back when they couldn't use magic. However, that struggle had abated drastically when they'd been able to learn how to light one. Omega. With knowledge, you end up not having to risk your life in situations where there's no need to die. Naturally, though, you mustn't let it become a waste of a treasure, so it does take talent to use it. Colette. Talent? Omega. Indeed. Without knowledge, or even if you do have the knowledge but lack the talent to use it, you'll just end up having stuff taken away from you. Like this cloak I own, for example. She pointed at her cloak that was hanging out to dry and continued the lecture she was giving Colette as she washed stuff in the river. Though she didn't have many of it, most of Omega's luggage had been borrowed from their original owners. That said, she had no way of returning any of it at the present, since they were already dead. But then, they probably would have sympathized as well, since this had been their just reward for trying to steal from Omega. This world was a survival of the fittest after all, just like how bigger fish eat the smaller ones. Omega. Or rather, I guess saying, the strong devour the weak is more apt. I prefer the saying, the survival of the fittest. But it's in my nature to want to use the most accurate one as possible. Colette, you've been through a lot as well, haven't you, Omega? Would it be because you've lived for so long? Omega. It's true that I've gotten way more opportunities to learn given that I've lived for so long. But the stuff I need to know keeps growing the longer I live on for. I don't think the day will come where I'd want to die, unless my thirst for knowledge runs out. In that respect, I feel like I'm able to enjoy life to its utmost. Colette. Is that so? Colette was trying her best to understand what she'd said, but it must have been a difficult topic for her. Omega batted one of her eyes shut at the girl, who looked like smoke was about to come out from her head. She then stretched up and turned her eye over to Colette as she continued with the washing. Omega, Colette, about that bracelet of yours. Colette. Oh, this. It'd end up getting drenched with river water if I kept it on while doing the washing, no. It'd be a real pain if it got washed away or started to rust. That's why I take it off. Omega. She'd quietly placed her silver bracelet on top of a tree stump by the riverside. The bracelet itself looked a bit like it had some work put into it, with artisan patterns running down both its inside and outside. It felt like it had value in its own right, such that wearing it wasn't deserved by a young girl dwelling in a forest. Omega, you seem to have a pretty decent upbringing, though. Where did you get that from? Colette, this is a memento from my mom and dad. They left it to me when they died, that's why I always carry it around with me. Omega. A memento from your parents, I see. Colette. They were working on a job that took them out from the village. This bracelet was something they brought back from the outside as well. I was really small, so I couldn't go with them, so they left me at my mom's sister's, my auntie's house. I learnt so much stuff there. She probably meant she'd learnt these skills of life, like cooking, washing, and hunting there. The trauma of her parents' death must have been like a scab that was still healing inside her as well. So long as no one tried to peel it off on purpose, the wounds would slowly heal until one day, she would start to not be ailed by them. That was the passage of time people lived under. Sweet music to Omega's ears. Omega. Colette, since it looks like it's still going to take some time for you to do the washing, you don't mind if I take a short walk, right? Come to think of it, lately I've been doing nothing but going back and forth between your house and the river. Colette. I did drag you from the river to my cabin, but… Colette's face looked meek when she heard her proposal. Omega tilted her head in response to her hesitation. Her reaction seemed rather odd in regards to an approval for just taking a walk. Omega. Is something the matter? Colette, no, nothing at all. It's just like, I don't think you should go too far towards the east side of the forest. They say that a witch beast lives there, so the villagers don't go near it. Omega. I see. The east side of the forest, yeah. I appreciate your worries. Omega left Colette behind by the river to continue with the washing as the latter saw her off, and went for her stroll. Then she stretched herself up as soon as Colette was out of sight. Omega. So, a witch beast's appeared in the east. She could safely say that a dangerous witch beast appearing there would be a life-threatening problem for both Colette and the villagers. Witch beasts were pure, unadulterated threats to most humans' lives. There were many different kinds of them, and their danger levels all varied as well. However, they'd no doubt be a danger to the average person, regardless of what species it was. As she thought about that, Omega's feet slowly made their way to the east side of the forest. Omega. Of course, it wasn't like Omega was trying to disregard Colette's words of warning for no reason. Though perhaps surprising, her warning made Omega feel unexpectedly grateful for Colette's kindness. If a girl with such pluckiness as hers was terrified of a witch beast, then she'd be willing to get rid of it. However, Omega came out into a small clearing in the east side of the forest. She gently stroked her pink hair, narrowing her eyes at the spectacle in front of her. Before her lay slightly frosted ground, and atop it she could see some scattered piles of stones. There must have been more than 30 of them there, more or less. If it had just been 1 or 2 of them, she could have dismissed them as being the work of a child's playfulness. But a deeper meaning started to take root with so many in one place. Considering there were so many piles of stones that had been carefully stacked, their purpose was clear. This place was a stranger. Who are you? Omega didn't show any particular signs of surprise at having heard a voice calling out from behind her. She'd been able to sense that someone had been approaching her by the sound of their footsteps as well as their scent. What she hadn't expected was that her opponent had called out to her. She'd been sure that they would have attacked her without bothering to exchange any dialogue. Omega. First things first, I hold no animosity towards you. I'd just like to put it out there that the reason I treaded in here was, well, it was on purpose, but not out of ill will. Oh, that reminds me, I don't have any kind of weapon on me, so I'm going to slowly turn around now. You aren't going to freak out, right, stranger? Just quit your damned babbling and turn yourself around. Omega held her hands up, showing she wasn't hostile, and then closed her mouth as well, so to show her opponent that she was doing exactly as they'd said. After that, she slowly turned back where she stood. Stranger. Never seen you before. A tall girl looked down at Omega as she said that. She was dressed in black clothes, had long dark hair, and was rather pretty. However, her sanpaku eyes were incredibly sharp, giving her an awfully piercing impression. Omega, Just after she'd finished processing her initial impressions, she noticed that the girl in front of her wasn't that old either. At most, she was 15 years old. Thus, there didn't seem to be much of an age difference between her and Colette. The only differences in their impressions came from her atmosphere and height. Stranger. What's with that reaction? You're such an irritating girl. Omega. Aren't you the one being awfully snappy at a young girl that you've just met? Besides, stranger, what? Omega. I mean, the fact that you're carrying around something like that was quite a shock for me too, you know. She'd realized from the signs she'd felt when she'd walked up behind her, mostly from its stench. That held within the arms of the girl with the baleful eyes was something really shocking. Namely, the cadaver of a living creature that had been wrapped up in white cloth. It must have once been in decent shape, she thought, but right now it didn't retain any of that. Omega. That's far too much of an overkill to call it hunting. Doing that would have ended up ruining both its flesh and hide. The way you went about it would be awful for securing them for their pelt or as food. Even so, Omega first trailed her words off and then continued, all the while examining the girl's reaction. Omega, if you're just killing them for the sake of it, then I won't say anything to you. Stranger, don't speak to me like you know everything. Sullenly flinging those words at her, the girl made her way past Omega and placed the cadaver on the ground, or rather, maybe she ought to call it something that was once a rabbit. Regardless, she placed it on the ground and began to dig a hole with the habu she'd brought along. TL note, habu, literally a digging stick, was an instrument used to dig out root crops and digging holes for the seeds for various grains. Basically an ancient shovel. She buried the body, covered it with soil and piled stones on top of it. As she looked at her doing this, Omega was convinced that the impression she'd harbored at the start wasn't a mistaken one. Just like she'd mused, this place was a graveyard. The remains of many critters must have been buried beneath the piles of stones, just like the rabbit from now, to be memorialized. Omega. I've been around graves a lot too, after all. Stranger. Who are you? Where did you come from? The girl finished her burial work, stood up, and asked that from Omega. There was quite an intensity about her in not bothering to hide her blood-stained hands. It felt to Omega like she was going to end up in this graveyard along with them if she screwed up her reply. Omega vied for friendly relations, hence she introduced herself, though not specifically due to the aforementioned reason. Omega, I am Omega, I'm pretty much a traveling vagrant. I just happened to drop by in the vicinity en route down the river. I won't be staying long, so I hope you won't be too harsh on me. Stranger. A traveler, huh? At your age, no, rather. Those ears of yours, are you an elf? Noticing Omega's distinctive ears, the girl's face turned to one of open discomfort. It made sense that a strong tide of discrimination remained towards elves in this era. Even so, her reaction seemed different to usual ones. She must have had still another reason for despising elves. However, before Omega could question her about it, she'd begun to walk back the way she'd come, with her hands still stained with blood. Omega, sorry to barge in, but the river's over there if you're looking to wash your hands. Stranger, you said you wouldn't be staying long, right? Take my advice and kindly hurry up and leave this place. Omega, I'm not really catching what this talk is about. I guess I must suck at this. The girl paid no heed to her casual chit-chat and started to walk away from the river without pause. And just before the back of her slipped out of sight, she spoke up, stranger. Because if you don't, then you too will eventually be torn apart by the beast. The girl left behind only those words before her figure vanished from Omega's sight. Omega. A beast, she says. 5 Omega. So that's what she told me. Do you happen to know anything about it, Colette? Omega told Colette about what had happened in the east of the forest as they had dinner by the fire. Colette puffed out her cheeks as she listened to her story, sipping from her vegetable soup. Colette, I did tell you not to go to the eastern side of the forest. Omega, did you? Ah, you did. However, I thought that I could help if you were having problems with a witch beast, considering that I can deal with most of them. That said, I didn't come across a witch beast, but rather a girl with a look so terrible in her eyes that it almost looked like a witch beast's. Colette, I think you mean Palmyra's. Was it actually an honor for said person to be pinpointed merely by the terrible look to their eyes? The boy Omega knew, who had the same terrible look, would definitely complain loudly and say it was disgraceful. Omega, I rather think there's a charm to it, but well, the feelings of others are things that can't be inferred by other people no matter where you go, so I suppose it can't be helped. Colette, so what did you talk to Palmyra about? Omega, I didn't really manage to have a proper conversation with her, Though, yeah, she told me to not stay long and hurry up and leave the forest if I valued my life. Colette. Hick, that's so. Colette raised her voice in a flash and stood up from where she was sitting. The bowl that had been resting on her lap toppled over, spilling its soup down onto the ground. Omega. Isn't that boiling hot, Colette? We ought to cool it down with some water as soon as possible. Colette. That's so selfish of her. Why would Palmyra do something like that? Speaking rapidly, Colette turned her quivering eyes towards Omega. Colette. Hey, Omega, you're not going to leave, right? Colette asked her that, not even paying any heed to how hot the soup was that had spilled onto her lap. She wasn't lending her ears to the words that girl, Palmyra, had said. She only wanted Omega to stay with her. However, that wish couldn't be granted by Omega. Omega, I'm glad about how you feel, but I wasn't planning on staying long from the start. My body's in far better shape thanks to these past few days. I'd like to repay you for your kindness, so I'd hope to at least take care of that witch beast in the forest, or whatever it is. Colette. Omega, Colette! Omega frowned at the fact she hadn't gotten any sort of response from her of either affirmation or denial. Then, after she'd called out her name, Colette let out a short sigh and said, Oh, Colette. Why, yeah, right? Yeah, of course. From the beginning, you were just dropping in for a short while, so it's only natural that you'd leave for another journey. It's only natural. The way she was saying it felt more like she was convincing herself rather than telling Omega. Then, Colette picked up her dishes and cleared them away, still half-eaten. Omega was lost for what to say to Colette, who had an air of tension about her. Despite that, she flashed Omega a smile as she cleared away her dinner and said, Colette, It's all right, Omega. I'm lonely, but not that lonely. So, Omega, feel free to set out on your journey. Well, that's what I'm planning on doing, but, Colette, yeah, go for it. That would be great. Definitely, it's for the best. After she said that, Colette turned her back away from Omega. Her small back looked pitiful, but it wasn't like she could say anything to her, so she kept her silence. She kept her unforgiving, ruthless silence. 6. Omega that night slowly woke up on her bed. In all honesty, getting up wasn't a strong point of hers. She didn't think this was an issue with her body, but rather one with her soul. When she thought back to it, she'd never been great at getting up, even when she'd had her own body. She hadn't been aware of it, but perhaps it was down to what they called low blood pressure. How strange it was that even changing the receptacle of her soul didn't solve her issues with her blood pressure one bit. But now wasn't the time to think about the relation of souls and blood pressure. Omega, it's not here. Her crude bed was just a blanket spread out on the floor. Her blue pyroxene, which should have been near her pillow, was nowhere to be seen. Omega typically wore it as a necklace, with it attached to a string, though naturally she took it off when going to sleep. She remembered doing that tonight before sleeping as well. Omega. Colette! A lick of flame came alight from Omega's raised fingers inside the pitch-black cabin. There was no sign of Colette in the bed next to hers, and her cloak, which should have been hanging on the wall, was also nowhere to be seen. Colette had vanished, and so had her pyroxene. This relationship between cause and effect probably went without saying. Omega. No way, it's hard to imagine she was out for money. Omega rubbed her weary eyes and hurriedly put her cloak on, before stepping outside of the cabin. The forest air at night was chilly, and her misty breaths sapped away the strength from her legs. But she didn't have the option to abandon her pyroxene and go back to bed. She couldn't part with it. It was one of her most important things in the world. Omega. As she began to walk, a sound rattled Omega's eardrums. She could hear a howl off in the distance. The howl had come from deep within the forest. It had been sharp, seeming to reach o'er yonder of the chilly night sky. As soon as Omega heard it, the word beast flashed through her mind. Omega, not a witch beast, a beast, huh? Omega recalled the state Palmyra had been in when she'd left her those words, and then took another step forward. There was no doubt as to where she was headed. The eastern forest. Omega. Omega narrowed her eyes as she entered the clearing she'd visited during the day, with the cemetery within. The scent of blood filling her nostrils lay thicker compared to what she'd smelled during the day, probably because of all the fresh blood that had newly been splattered around the graveyard. Omega. Omega gave a curt nod of her chin as she gazed at the graveyard, which was now dyed in red. The flesh and blood that was scattered around must have belonged to animals that lived in the forest. At a glimpse, the scene looked gruesome. However, none of the flesh and blood there appeared to be human. Could that have been an expression of the beast's conscience? Omega, or perhaps it already decided on its first target. Omega slowly took a look around the graveyard and the cadavers. The light of the moon was obstructed by heavy clouds, and the ground was shrouded in a darkness so still that it would make anyone want to die. Yet the host of fireballs that Omega had conjured cut through the darkness without relent. They became quite literally lamplights that laid bare the state of the blood-stained surroundings. That, and it was nothing short of an act of despicableness for those who dwelled in the darkness, who held no love for light. Stranger. Letter 3-1, letter 3-1. The beast came flying out from the veil of darkness, letting off a ferocious howl. It thundered towards Omega at razor-sharp speed and threw its claws at her with tremendous force. She'd surely end up like the flesh and blood scattered around them if she ended up on the receiving end of its attack. Having said that, Omega didn't have the finesse to dodge these attacks quickly enough. In regards to her physical ability, she was as delicate and frail as a child, just like she looked. Though despite being slender, she was still made from different stock than your atypical half-elf that could break even boulders by hitting them. Omega. My, that reminded me of someone I dislike. Omega's face soured a few moments before its claws stuck into her head as memories flashed through her mind. The speed which significant thoughts flash by at was far quicker compared to actually moving her body. There were some theories that stated that the flashbacks that appear on the verge of death were look-up operations which the brain, caved by the risk of death, did, using one's own memories to find a way to escape from the situation at hand. That's just how overwhelming the speed of her thoughts was. The claws of the beast still hadn't reached Omega, even as she finished with her absurd intrusion of thoughts. Thence, a protective wall of earth easily got in the way of her enemy's attack. Omega, Dona! She didn't actually need to recite the incantation. If anything, the wall of earth rose up far quicker than the movement of her lips. Even so, she'd still bothered to chant it because she liked to put stuff that happened into words. Omega. The beast was thrown up from underneath by the rising wall of earth and was blown up into the night sky. Its small shadow spun round and round. However, it quickly kicked out at a nearby tree branch, stopped itself from spinning, and fell back to earth. It skillfully protected its head and back from the fall, landing on the ground on its own 4 limbs. Not too shabby. However, Omega, didn't I hit you a moment ago using that very same earth? There was no way it was going to best her attack with a mere stopgap countermeasure. Her attack commenced before the beast, who had now landed on the ground, made its next move. Once again, the earth writhed, and this time it swallowed the beast's limbs within, pinning it down. The beast, letter 3-1, letter 3-1. With its arms and legs swallowed all the way up to its knees and elbows, it had absolutely nowhere left to place its strength. An earthen stake savagely rose up towards the exposed belly of the pitiful, struggling beast as it lay unable to move. The beast, letter 3-1, letter 3-1, Omega. Using everything around as tools is where you really get to show off your skills as a mage. Wind, earth, fire, water, all of it under my spell. This must be how it feels like to make the world your enemy. Omega muttered those words out without any real emotion as she unleashed her vicious blow. Receiving it, the beast was struck in its belly. It gulped down a roar of pain and lifted its face up, baring its fangs. The beast, letter 3-1, letter 3-1. Omega, you still look lively, don't you? Shall we perhaps do 2 or 3 more of these? Omega closed one of her eyes as she looked at the lively, howling beast, and then she pointed her palm at it. Her earthen stake had punched against its guts, albeit she had rounded its tip before she'd unleashed it, to go easy on it. However, perhaps it'd be easier for her to fire off a sharp one into it. For now, if she had to resort to bloodshed to stop its movements, then, stranger. That's enough already. Omega had tried to stick her palm out and unleash a barrage of attacks on it. However, she was stopped in her tracks. Reflected in her cold, blue eyes was first the struggling beast, whose limbs were caught in the ground, and then the girl who'd stood in front of the beast to protect it, Palmyra. Large tears were welling up in her round eyes as she glared at Omega. Omega, what are you doing? Palmyra. I beg you enough already. Don't you think there's no need to go any further? Omega. It's up to you if you can't bear to watch, but I cannot help but feel that it would be irresponsible of me to leave this be. I imagine that in the first place, they must have been a bother for you too, right? You must have been shunning the beast. Palmyra. No, as if I'd ever think I want you to kill the beast. Palmyra turned around as tears streamed down her face, disregarding Omega's words with a snarl. Then she wrapped her arms around the shackled beast, pulling it into a tight embrace. Palmyra. I never wanted to turn Colette into a witch. I wanted to help her. She desperately shouted that as she continued to embrace the beast, rather Colette. 7. All the strange things about this had been visible in various respects from the start. The way Colette lived, for example. Why would a girl of only 12 or 13 years of age be living alone in a ramshackle cabin in a forest right next to a village? She had told her that her parents had passed away, but she was still too young to be living on her own. She was precisely at the kind of age where the villagers ought to be looking after her, given that she'd been born in its vicinity. Communal life wouldn't be possible if not for the spirit of people mutually helping each other out. If they weren't going to help her out, then that meant Omega. The very fact that a young girl has ended up living in a ramshackle cabin in the forest is proof that Colette is shunned by the people of the village. She can't get any help from the adults, so she's had no choice but to live on her own. Though, surprisingly enough, it seems like she's been living quite a strong life. She'd acquired her cooking and hunting skills back when her parents were alive. Despite not receiving any love from the villagers, the love she'd received from her parents had kept her from dying. However, having been shunned and turned away from her village, the girl's loneliness had attracted a different problem. Namely, the issue which Palmyra had shouted at her, Omega. A witch. This sure is a fateful thing. Colette's living circumstances, the presence of the beast, which Palmyra had told her about, as well as the word witch that she'd cried out as she embraced the struggling Colette. The whole picture surrounding this snowy forest became clear from the fragmented pieces. There'd been a downward spiral, wrought by the fear they'd held against the unavoidable witch. Palmyra, it started when Colette's parents died. Palmyra let go of Colette as she twisted her body with a bestial roar and began to talk. The death of Colette's parents. That had been the trigger for the collapse of everything. Palmyra. Colette's house was attacked by a witch beast. Both of her parents were killed, leaving only Colette behind. The house was left in a dreadful state, and Colette's parents, having been attacked by the witch beast, had apparently been left in a state so terrible that no one could bear to look at them. Palmyra had said that Colette had ended up being the only one to survive in this bloody house. Colette had afterwards been taken in by one of her relatives in the village and begun to live there. However, tragedy wasn't going to let her escape. Palmyra, the witch beast hadn't overlooked Colette after it failed to kill her. It found the house that had taken Colette in and Omega. Sunk its fangs into that family, I imagine. Witch beasts are the nemeses of mankind. It's really no wonder that there's some around that show such guile if it's for the sake of killing or maiming. Palmyra. The harm the witch beast brought didn't end only with that. It went on and on. The witch beast had kept pursuing Colette without showing signs of relenting. Tragedy struck each house every time that Colette was taken into them. Despite that, the witch beast had never bothered to kill Colette. As the damage spread, no matter how kind of heart the villagers were, they became unable to keep her. They perceived the presence of the girl named Colette as a burden. Palmyra. In the end, they got so spooked out, to the point that no one would take Colette in. The opposite, in fact, they drove her away to a small forest cabin. It was like she was, Omega, a human sacrifice. Omega took over for Palmyra as she choked for words. Palmyra's expression stiffened as soon as she heard her. She was a rather innocent girl, unlike what you would imagine from her face. You could perhaps say that she was good of heart, in stark contrast to her upbringing. Nevertheless, she couldn't help but say it was a meaningless sentimentality when compared to the facts at hand. Omega, when you consider it from the perspective of protecting the village, they must have thought that offering Colette as a sacrifice would have resulted in less damage. compared to defeating this dangerous witch beast. It's only natural, from a risk management point of view. Rituals where sacrifices were offered to pray for things such as good weather and bountiful harvest have been carried out everywhere throughout the course of history. In all honesty, Omega couldn't see the validity in offering sacrifices to unwilling enemies. However, if said enemy presented a concrete threat, then she could say that trying to draw out its warmth wasn't that bad of a move. Omega. Although, that presumes your enemy's one that can understand conversation. Palmyra, I know, right? Why would a witch beast that lacks all manner of reason leave, even if they offered Colette to it? I didn't really get it, and I'm still unconvinced. But the entire village was gripped by fear. That's why they tried to offer Colette, Omega. As a sacrifice, well, no, not just that. When I think back to the warning you gave me, Palmyra, it's obvious. Palmyra, Omega, it's nothing. The villagers thought that Colette was the witch beast's master, right? She could say that too, was a natural development. They'd been attacked by the witch beast over and over again, and each time, only Colette had survived. It was logical that people would turn their eyes suspiciously towards Colette as it kept happening. A sacrifice for the witch beast was a nice excuse, with the real reason being to keep the dangerous Colette away from the village. It must have been the least scrap of conscience the villagers could spare, for them to not have made any attempt to kill Colette. Omega, well, I suppose they were protecting themselves. Humans aren't good at sympathizing with others in times where they can't afford to. Palmyra. And like that, the villagers started to call Colette a witch. Omega, I see. No better proof of being kicked out than that. Mending their ties had already become futile, now that they'd insulted her with a curse that spelled out the most abominable being in the world. She knew what it meant for Colette to live in the forest, alone. And if Omega's conjecture was right, the manhunt should have started, rather than ended. Omega. There were incidents where animals were gruesomely slain in the forest, right? This graveyard serves as a place for you to bury these brutalized animals. You made it, am I right, Palmyra? How, Omega? Elementary, my dear Watson. Her much unneeded words she'd squeezed in didn't get through to the frantic Palmyra. By wanting to show off her knowledge as well, she'd ended up messing about, saying words which held no particularly positive meaning to them. Without brushing back on her casual remark, Omega circled her hand around and pointed at the gravestones, Omega. In fact, similar things to this happened everywhere 400 years ago. Back in those days, the requirements you needed to become a witch were rather unclear. That's why, to put it in other words, some thought that maybe anyone could become a witch, provided they fulfilled the minimum requirements. Thus, weird rituals became widespread. There'd been quite a lot of these rituals, so gruesome they had been, that they'd make anyone with a delicate disposition avert their eyes. She could truly say that back then, the world was at its darkest. Omega, this is off topic, but why must rituals always escalate towards the path of gruesomeness? Wouldn't it be great if once in a while we had a ritual taking place during the day, rather than at night, where we just laid flowers out? Palmyra, what are you trying to say, Omega? Whoops, pardon me. Well, it's nothing so complicated. What I mean is that the girl who's been treated as a witch by the villagers decided she might as well actually try and become one. Or perhaps she started the ritual because she was under the impression that she'd become one. So regardless of the actual person's intent, the ritual would prove effective when the conditions were right. Living alone in the forest, Colette had involuntarily brought about these conditions. Omega, the factors choose those who are qualified. Had she been found by them, the path to being a witch would have opened. Unfortunately, though, it seems like the witch factors of this era have already found qualified individuals. Well, I suppose this is a witch-lacking era, thanks to that kid who's keeping a bunch of them on their own. For starters, in this era, they called those with witch factors names like sin archbishops, rather than witches. Quite rightly, the way they were treated didn't change, no matter how they were called. Omega, looks like I got sidetracked again. Anyways, Colette was alienated from her village due to this, and so, left alone, she began to dip her hands into carrying out these gruesome rituals to try her darndest to become a witch, luckily. It doesn't seem like she's sullied her hands past killing some animals, though it would have only been a matter of time. Palmyra, She would have probably, hurt someone if we'd left her alone, Omega. Indeed. Oh dear, without a doubt I would have been the prime candidate for that. Or perhaps it would have been you. Both of us were lured into the forest. Had Palmyra come here to the graveyard tonight because she'd predicted things were about to move forward. Considering she was actively carrying out the ritual, the concept of opening a path towards becoming a witch by cutting herself free from all of her attachments wasn't a bad one. She had a really keen eye. However, Palmyra's prediction was off the mark here. Colette hadn't set her mind on that. Omega, I'm sorry to say, but this girl is not a witch, and getting more into this, her true nature isn't that of a beast either. By the way, Palmyra, is it okay if I ask you something? Palmyra, what is it? If you know so much, what are you even? Omega, the villagers fear a witch beast, but no one has seen it, right? As she said this, Omega walked over to the two embracing girls. She stretched out her hand over to the still struggling Colette and gently took off the bracelet she was wearing on her wrist. Instantly, the strength from Colette's body left her. Palmyra, Colette, what did you do to her? Omega, she's only lost her consciousness since the link's been severed. She used up way too much of her strength, so it's really no wonder that she fell asleep immediately. At any rate, Colette let out soft breaths as she slept, despite Palmyra's panic. Her angelic sleeping face felt quite out of place in this brutal situation. But that couldn't be helped either, considering that she probably had no idea that she was the beast. Omega, meteors, they were named after shooting stars because they can make your wishes come true. Wishes like that were fleeting. In the long run, they became a breeding ground for causing trouble, deviating from the manufacturer's intent. Both now and in the days of yore, that was the main issue underlying these meteors. Was it the wishes people had which were tainted, or the tools themselves? Perhaps it would have been better to also include an instruction manual with them. Omega. Though you should be able to hazard a guess at what kind of use the tool has just by looking at it. Anyhow, there were many cases where they wouldn't, so maybe she was overestimating the general public. Either way, Omega, Colette won't be running rampant anymore, so long as she gets rid of her bracelet. Palmyra, but that's a memento her parents left her. Omega, this is the beasting bracelet, that's what the meteor is called. It's a tool that you can activate even if you don't possess any special powers. A harness that people who lack strength may use to protect themselves. There'd once been a time where humanity had been swamped with enemies. The beasting bracelet had been created out of pity for humans, who back then were putting their lives at risk even to just set up camp. It had been created to help them. Omega, when it senses danger, its owner's mana is temporarily increased, making it so their body is able to fight. The owner's sense of reason decreases drastically in exchange, and they become similar to a beast. That's why it's called the beasting bracelet. Palmyra. Then it's all because of this damn bracelet that Colette's parents and all of the other victims. Omega. I heard that her parents were merchants who had dealings with the outside. I dare say they got their hands on the beasting bracelet from somewhere there. They made it into a gift for their daughter, and after that, on that fateful night, the beasting bracelet had transformed Colette into a beast, and carnage had ensued. Typically, the meteor would spring into motion whenever danger loomed. However, it wasn't all too strange a naive girl could feel danger coming from even the turmoils of a nightmare. Omega. The same thing occurred wherever she was taken in, until finally she ended up alone. Ironically enough, Colette thought of herself as being dangerous, after being treated as the root of all evil. Contrarily, that made her acquire the qualifications to control the bracelet. The killing of those animals was an in-your-face resistance. That was the truth of the matter that surrounded Colette, the girl who lived in the forest all on her own. She'd lost her family, she'd been shunned by the villagers, and she'd been driven away into the forest. The little girl had kept performing her ritual to turn herself into a witch instead of sealing up the fearsome beast. But this time she was going to sacrifice the traveler who'd stopped by her place to turn herself into an actual witch. Omega. That's ridiculous. Palmyra. Omega. Does she really think that killing all those wild rabbits is going to turn her into a witch? That's a child's dream. Omega looked up above her as she said that. The sky was still covered in heavy clouds, with not a star in sight. That irked her. so she swung her arms up. In an instant, a gust of wind kicked into life far above in the skies and dispersed the clouds, revealing the pale moon behind. Palmyra. Hga moonlight poured down from the pale moon, illuminating the girls in the forest clearing. Then the girl who was embracing the beast and was face to face with this ancient being gasped, because the girl who'd been standing before her eyes was Omega. I see. The fact that you can keep your cool while looking at me means you have promise. A white-haired witch with the hint of a smile on her face. Omega. The villagers cursed Colette as a witch, right? That's no good. Something like this being mistaken as a witch would make both I, as well as those girls, turn in their grave. Palmyra. Eep. Omega, the village was this way, right? I'm terrible with directions, you see. The witch smiled at Palmyra as her throat froze, before then asking her that. Still unable to muster any kind of thoughts, all the frightened Palmyra could do was nod repeatedly. Omega, my thanks. The witch thanked her for her reply and began to slowly walk away, straight towards the village, to show each and every one of those cretins who'd mistaken Colette as a witch the real truth. Palmyra. Palmyra had felt her heart freeze over as she'd looked at the witch walking off into the distance. After she'd left, she turned her gaze up to the sky, at the moon. The pale moon was looking down on the two embracing girls, silent as ever. 8. She nibbled on some cured meat that had been left over and warmed her body up with some warm water. Then she put on her dried cloak, and straight after she'd made sure that her shoes were on again, her journey preparations were complete. Omega, I ended up staying longer than I'd imagined, though I guess I did enjoy myself more than I thought. Even ordinary daily life was a treasure in and of itself, for one with a penchant for being able to enjoy just about every kind of event unknown. So long as it abounded with stuff happening, she needed no more. Omega. That said, nothing substantial remains. That must be my fate as well. As she spilled those words out in a quiet tone, Omega exited the cabin that had served her for several days. Since its owner wasn't in, she had no one to say farewell to. A thank you letter would be a bother as well, she supposed. Omega. A bird fouls not the nest as it is about to leave. Well, after it's been fouled plenty already. Leaving these impressions behind, Omega left the cabin, went through the forest, walked across the empty graveyard, before finally she stepped out onto the path outside of the forest. She would resume her aimless journey once more. With those feelings in mind, Omega would, stranger. Where are you going all on your own, Omega? Omega. Now this is an unexpected reunion. Having been called from behind, Omega turned around, feeling slightly taken aback. Two young girls standing side by side appeared in her field of view. The two girls, Colette and Palmyra, were holding hands, eyes fixed on Omega. Omega, you couldn't have come all the way here just to see me off, right? I shouldn't really be saying this, but I don't think we parted in the best manner. Palmyra. You realize that, and you're still saying it. Look, you forgot something. Palmyra tossed something over to her after she'd finished speaking. Omega instantly stretched out her hand to catch it as it arced towards her. She tried to catch it but failed, and the object dropped to the ground. Omega. Oh, damn it. I nearly forgot about it. Palmyra, are you for real? It looks pretty important. You must be out of your mind. Palmyra gave Omega a sigh as she picked up the important object that had fallen near her feet, her blue pyroxene. Beside Palmyra, Colette raised her voice and called out with an, Omega, Colette. I really have so many apologies I need to give you. After all, Omega, nearly killed me. Well, sometimes such things happen when you're alive. In reality, 'twas no more than an attempt, so you needn't fret about it. Colette, but that's not fair. Come on, please, please let me make it up to you. Don't just keep everything away from you and shut me out like that. Omega. Faced with Colette's vehement attitude, Omega once again felt regretful that she'd messed up with her choice of words. She just wanted to tell her not to worry, so how had it ended up like this? Omega. You don't need to thank me. You being treated as a witch was a result of a series of unfortunate accidents. We identified the source, so the misunderstanding should have been cleared up. No one in the village should be treating you as a witch anymore, right? Colette. That's right. Definitely not. Omega. I see. That makes me glad. A lot of slip-ups had happened that couldn't be remedied, but she was glad that at least one of them had turned out well. The village had turned into pandemonium when an actual witch had visited. Since she'd staged it to be as untraumatic as possible, the villagers would only be left having nightmares for the rest of their lives. Omega. All that's left is to pray that they don't accidentally choke on their own vomit. Palmyra. Do you have any idea what you're saying? Omega. I was just pointing it out from a logical perspective. Was there something strange about that? Palmyra let out a deep sigh as Omega cocked her head, with the latter unable to comprehend her reaction. Colette piped up in her place, with an Colette. It's thanks to you, Omega, that everyone in the village doesn't believe that I'm a witch. And their misunderstanding about the beast has also been cleared up, but you know. Omega, but, Colette, they also know now that I'm friends with a witch. Omega, that's... Omega frowned as Colette said with a tap of her flat chest. An actual witch making its appearance had worked in proving that Colette wasn't a real one. However, it seemed like this kind of treatment had worked too well. The villagers sought the reason why an actual witch had appeared, and thus, Colette had once again bore the brunt of the blame. Meaning, Colette, this time I can't stay in either the village or the forest. Omega, I see. Yeah, I kinda get it. I kinda can't help but feel like it's partly my fault. Palmyra, no, it's definitely all your fault. Palmyra interrupted Omega as she stumbled for words, clearly stating it. Almost floored by the force of her argument, Omega suddenly took notice of the outfits the two of them were wearing. Now that she looked properly, they were both wearing travel clothing. And not the sort you'd wear for a small trip, they were fully decked for a journey. Colette, didn't I already tell you, I can't stay in the village? Palmyra, and I've also used up all my courtesy with that village. That's why I'm going with Colette. Colette, so like we were going to discuss it from here, but are you really all right by yourself, Omega? Her question caught Omega off guard in its fullest sense. And that was why the eyes of the two girls shone brightly as they looked at Omega, her facial expression having changed without meaning to. One of them was full of unbridled delight, while the other was full of pernicious delight. Omega, I've told you this many times, but my journey is an aimless one. I cannot promise you that it'll be a spectacular all-action grand adventure like you both desire. Colette, Spectacu. I don't really get you, but if it's with Omega, I bet it'll be really fun. I just love hanging out with friends. Palmyra, I don't trust you to that extent, but I feel like both you and Colette would fall into danger if I left you both to your own devices. Colette happily clutched Palmyra's arm as she seemed to tail off into a sulk. Then, Omega let out a deep, deep breath as she looked at the girl beaming from eye to eye at her. Omega, all right. I do need to teach you how to use the bee-sting bracelet as well. I don't know how far we'll be able to stick together, but you're both welcome to do as you like until you get fed up with it. Colette, yay, way to go. Let's keep treating each other well, Omega. Both Colette and Palmyra hurriedly shuffled over by Omega's side as she walked off in resignation. Having found companions in this unexpected place, Omega's aimless journey, regardless, continued. Omega, an aimless journey, huh? Well, compared to that boring journey, it's far, far better, I guess. Omega walked with the girls, reminiscing about an incident that had occurred once. The blue pyroxene hanging down from her neck shook. Illuminated by the sunlight, it glittered brightly. It almost looked like it was trying to say something to Omega. However, the complaints coming from the blue pyroxene only reached Omega's ears. The end.